The moment you hear it, something inside you tightens, because the question hits harder than expected. What if the reason your life still feels torn is because you have been trying to stitch Jesus onto a version of yourself that was never meant to survive? Imagine holding a ripped sleeve in your hands, threads barely clinging, and instead of replacing it, you press a bright new piece of fabric against it, hoping no one will notice the difference. That is what many people do with faith. They add a little prayer on top of old habits, sprinkle a little religion over wounded pride, patch a verse onto a lifestyle built on self, and then they wonder why everything starts tearing faster. Jesus knew this pattern long before we ever named it. In one short parable, he cut straight through the illusion so sharply that it still echoes today. No one takes new cloth and sews it onto an old garment. If they do, the new pulls away from the old and the tear becomes worse. There is nothing gentle in that truth. It confronts you before you can look away. It tells you that adding God to an old life does not heal it. It destroys the illusion that you can stay the same and still carry the kingdom. And that is exactly where the shock begins. Because in our world, people love upgrades. We upgrade phones, habits, routines, diets, even spirituality. We want everything fast, simple, adjustable. We want faith that works like an app, something we can add to the home screen without changing the system underneath. But Jesus is not an app. He is not software. He does not install onto an old operating system. His presence crashes anything built on pride, fear, or self-preservation. The old garment cannot handle him. Think about the version of you that you still try to protect. The you built on old patterns, old coping mechanisms, old secrets, old wounds you refuse to expose. Maybe you keep it pressed together with a smile, maybe with achievement, maybe with a reputation you hope no one looks too closely at. But deep down you know the cloth is thin. You feel the strain when no one is watching. You hear the whisper that something is about to give. And then you try to fix it by attaching a piece of Jesus to it. You pray when you panic. You open the Bible only when everything else fails. You ask for peace while refusing surrender. You want transformation without sacrifice, comfort without obedience, blessing without change. It does not work. It will never work. The shock of this parable is that Jesus never offered to fix the old life. He offered a new one, completely new. And that new life cannot attach to what you used to be. It is too strong, too alive, too real. The moment it pulls, the old fabric rips apart. Some people feel that tearing and assume God is abandoning them, but the opposite is true. The tearing reveals that you were never meant to live patched. You were meant to be remade. The modern world tells you to improve yourself. Jesus tells you to surrender yourself. The world says adjust. Jesus says begin again. The world says hide the tear. Jesus says let it rip so I can replace it. And this is where your journey into the parable truly begins. Not with comfort, but with confrontation. Not with a soft whisper, but with the realization that every attempt to sew Jesus onto what is old will only increase the damage. If something in your chest feels exposed right now, let it. The tearing is not your end. It is the first sign that a new garment is waiting. Picture the ancient world, not as a distant place, but as a mirror held up to your own life. A world where a single garment took weeks to create and months to afford, and where every thread carried the weight of a person's story. Because an old garment was never just fabric. It was survival, identity, memory, pride, and pain, woven together until the shape no longer matched the body wearing it, yet people refused to let it go, because familiarity feels safer than freedom, even when it hurts. And this is exactly why Jesus chose that image, to expose what we still try to hide today. That each of us is wearing an old garment made from habits we cling to, wounds we refuse to face, stories we repeat to protect our ego, and identities stitched together from praise, fear, shame, and the desire to prove we are enough. And no matter how thin or distorted or exhausted that garment becomes, we keep it, because losing it feels like losing ourselves. So we patch it, we reinforce the parts tearing apart, we avoid the truth that it is falling to pieces. And into that denial, Jesus brings a brand new cloth, a cloth too strong, too pure, too alive to be sewn into what is already weak. And the shock of his parable is that he knew exactly what would happen if someone tried. The new cloth would pull, the old threads would fail, and the tear would become far worse than before. And while that made perfect sense to ancient listeners who knew the behavior of fabric, modern people miss the deeper truth that Jesus was never talking about laundry. He was talking about identity. Because in his world, your garment told everyone who you were, your tribe, your rank, your history, your cleanliness, your shame, your worth, all of it visible before you ever spoke a word. So when he said the old garment had to go, he was saying the identity you built from pain and pride and performance cannot survive the pressure of the kingdom he brings. And whether you admit it or not, you have grown attached to that old identity. The strong one, the self-made one, the guarded one, the one who learned how to impress others or hide weaknesses or pretend to be whole, the one stitched together from survival instincts you picked up long before you ever thought about following God, the one that still whispers to you that you are safer being who you used to be, and that old garment may look fine on the outside, but you know the truth. It is stretched thin around fears you never resolved, stained by regrets you never confessed, warped by expectations you never chose. And every time life pulls at you, you feel the strain, because patching does not heal anything. It only delays the collapse. Yet even now, many people want to add Jesus as a patch, but not as a replacement. They want a little peace without surrender, a little healing without exposure, a little meaning without transformation. They want God to make the garment feel new without ever removing it. But Jesus refuses, because he is not here to upgrade the old life. He is here to end it and start something completely new. And the strength of his new cloth will always expose the weakness of the old one. And that tearing you sometimes feel in your heart is not God abandoning you. It is the unavoidable friction between who you were and who he is trying to make you. Because the new and the old cannot coexist, no matter how much you try to force them to blend. And the longer you try to keep the old intact, the more painful the tearing becomes. Not because God is cruel, but because truth is incompatible with pretense. Grace is incompatible with self-preservation. Healing is incompatible with denial. And the new identity Jesus offers is incompatible with the one you stitched together out of fear. And here is the part that should shake you awake. You have carried your old garment for so long that you probably call it personality or maturity or just the way I am. But Jesus sees straight through those labels and sees the real issue, that the garment you trust the most is the one hurting you the deepest. And if you keep sewing patches of spirituality onto it, the strain will only grow worse, because the new cloth was never meant to help the old survive. It was meant to replace it entirely. And before we move any further, you must face the question you have avoided for years. If God offered you a brand new garment, one that required you to drop the identity you built to survive, would you actually let go? Or would you hold the old one tighter and pretend it still fits? And now the question you must answer in your heart. What is the oldest part of your garment you are still afraid to release? Imagine standing in a crowd watching religious leaders stare at Jesus with a mixture of fascination and fear, men who had spent their entire lives stitching and restitching the garment of their tradition, polishing rules, tightening rituals, layering interpretations on top of interpretations until the system felt sacred simply because it was old. And now here stood a man whose presence threatened every stitch they had ever sewn. But instead of surrendering, they tried to do what many still do today: sew him in just enough to look spiritual without ever letting anything truly change. And this is where the parable of the new cloth becomes explosive, because Jesus was not confronting secular sinners. He was confronting people who thought they were already close to God, people who assumed they knew how faith was supposed to work, people who imagined the Messiah would come to validate their system, not expose it. Yet deep inside they were terrified, because they could feel that the new cloth he carried was not something they could stitch into their hierarchy. It was something powerful enough to tear it apart. And so they attempted the same strategy. Modern religion still attempts. Keep the old structure intact, but borrow enough of Jesus to appear renewed, attach his miracles to their authority, attach his teaching to their tradition, attach his influence to their social status, as if the kingdom of God could ever be woven into a garment designed to protect human pride. But Jesus refused every attempt. And the refusal was not polite, it was explosive, because grace cannot be sewn into a system built on performance. Truth cannot be attached to structures built on fear. And the presence of God cannot be used as an accessory to validate institutions built on ego. And the leaders hated him for that, because they wanted control, not surrender. They wanted admiration, not transformation. They wanted a Messiah who reinforced their power, not one who revealed their emptiness. But the parable made one thing impossible to ignore, especially for the crowd watching, that the strength of the new will always tear apart the weakness of the old. And nothing exposes this faster than religion, because religion loves patches, it loves the appearance of holiness, it loves being respected for devotion, it loves systems that reward performance. But the kingdom Jesus carried is alive and wild and untamable. And when it pulls on an old system, the whole thing rips. And what ripped then still rips now, because people in the modern world still try to sew Jesus into their religion rather than surrender to his kingdom. They attend church to feel safe but refuse transformation. They memorize verses while protecting secret pride. They love worship that moves their emotions but ignore obedience that moves their lives. They want Jesus to enhance their spiritual image, not overthrow the framework they built. And so they treat him like a decorative stitch, something beautiful on the surface, but never allowed to reach the core, and the pressure becomes unbearable because every patching attempt creates tension between appearance and reality, between public faith and private truth, between the God they claim to follow and the idols they refuse to let go, and that tension tears them apart from the inside. Not because God is punishing them, but because mixed loyalties always create spiritual collapse. And Jesus saw this happening to the leaders who listened to him. He saw them trying to merge old power structures with new spiritual language, trying to maintain authority while borrowing his influence, trying to preserve the garment of tradition even as it decayed. But Jesus made the collision unavoidable because he came to replace, not reinforce, and any system that tries to attach him without surrendering to him eventually tears open. And that truth should shake modern believers awake, because many still try to do what the Pharisees did, blend a little Jesus into a life built on control, keep their old routines but add a Christian label, keep their old motivations but add a spiritual vocabulary, keep their pride but sprinkle God words on top, hoping the disguise will hold. But the new cloth does not cooperate with pretend devotion. It pulls until the false threads snap, exposing what was hidden beneath. And the tearing is often humiliating, painful, disruptive, but also merciful, because Jesus will not let people stay deceived by systems that cannot save them. He tears down everything that was built to impress, so he can rebuild everything that was meant to be surrendered. And before you distance yourself from those ancient leaders, consider how often you have tried to do the same. How often you hoped Jesus would strengthen your plans instead of rewriting them. How often you wanted him to validate your version of faith instead of dismantling it. How often you resisted his voice when it pulled at places you had stitched tightly shut. And the question becomes unavoidable. If the old garment of religion could not hold him, then what makes you think your patched identity can hold him now? And if you feel something pulling inside you, even as you hear this, do not ignore it. Because the pull is grace refusing to be a patch. It is truth refusing to stay on the surface. It is the kingdom refusing to be decorative. And it is Jesus refusing to let you live divided. And now the question must be asked, the same question the crowd faced 2,000 years ago. Are you trying to follow him or simply sew him in? Look closely at your own life, and you may see the same pattern that Jesus confronted in the people around him. A pattern of spiritual patchwork, where you reach for God only in the moments when the seams of your identity begin to split. And instead of surrendering the garment entirely, you press a small piece of faith against the tear, hoping it can hold everything together. But deep inside, you know it cannot, because you have spent years crafting an identity from achievements, relationships, opinions, trauma responses, and tiny rituals that make you feel safe. And every time life pulls on one thread, the entire structure trembles. So you reach for Jesus, the way someone reaches for glue when their favorite object breaks, not to rebuild, but to preserve what is already falling apart. And you whisper the same quiet negotiation. So many believers whisper today, just fix this one part of me, but do not touch the rest. Just help me stop feeling anxious, but do not ask me to trust you. Just help me recover from heartbreak, but do not speak about the patterns that caused it. Just bless me, but do not change me. And then you wonder why nothing truly transforms, why you can attend church and still feel hollow, why you can pray and still feel powerless, why you can memorize scripture but still feel chained to the same cycles. And the answer is brutally simple. You are trying to patch Jesus onto an identity built without him, and the tearing grows worse Not because God is distant, but because patching is not the same as surrender. Patching is survival, while Jesus is calling you into resurrection. Patching is pride disguised as faith, because it says, I can still hold most of this together if God just helps with the weak points. And the truth is, you cannot hold any of it together without him. And the more you pretend you can, the more the old garment strains under the pull of the new, until eventually something inside you breaks. And for many, that collapse does not look dramatic. It looks like quiet exhaustion, like a soul worn thin from trying to be both surrendered and in control, like a heart trying to trust God while still clinging tightly to the idols that keep it comfortable, like a mind trying to believe truth while feeding off habits that reinforce lies. And Jesus knew this tension would destroy people long before they understood what was happening, which is why he spoke in a parable, simple enough for a child, but powerful enough to split the human heart in two. Because the old identity cannot hold the new life, no matter how carefully you stitch the edges. And modern believers are often worse at accepting this than ancient ones, because we have built a culture obsessed with managing appearances, curating images, polishing the outside of our lives while the inside quietly falls apart. And when the pressure hits, we add spiritual language, the way someone adds filters to a broken picture, adjusting the brightness without addressing the cracks, and the result is a kind of religion that looks alive but feels dead, a faith that sings loudly but surrenders rarely, a devotion that posts verses online but hides fear in private, a spirituality that performs but does not transform. And Jesus sees through every patch, every pose, every mask, not to shame you, but to free you from the weight of pretending. Because pretending is exhausting and patching is endless, and both will eventually tear you apart. And perhaps the most dangerous part of modern faith is that people do not recognize patching when they are doing it. They call it balance or wisdom or being realistic, but often it is simply fear. Wearing respectable clothing, fear of losing control, fear of exposure, fear of the unknown, fear of who they might become if they let God take everything, and yet that fear is exactly what keeps them bound. Because Jesus did not ask for your patches. He asked for your life, all of it, every thread, every hidden motive, every quiet sin, every unspoken wound. Not so he could shame you, but so he could remake you. And if you listen carefully, you may notice that the areas where you feel the most strain are the exact areas where you have been patching instead of surrendering, the relationship you keep mending instead of releasing, the habit you keep hiding instead of confessing, the identity you keep defending instead of letting die, the belief you keep clinging to, even though it tears you down a little more each day. And Jesus whispers into that place with unnerving clarity. The new cannot live inside the old. The more you try to force them together, the more you will break. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something is incompatible between what you were and what you are becoming. And before this truth can heal you, it must confront you. So ask yourself with painful honesty, where have you been trying to add God without surrendering to God? Where have you been asking for peace while protecting the patterns that steal your peace? Where have you been stitching Jesus onto habits and identities that were never meant to survive? And if you dare to see the truth, the first tear you feel will not be punishment. It will be the beginning of freedom, because the garment must tear before the new one can be given. To understand why Jesus refused to patch the old system, you have to understand what the old system actually was. Not the caricature people imagine today, but the real structure of law and ritual that shaped Israel for centuries. A system that was never evil, but was never final either. A system designed to diagnose the sickness of the human heart, but never designed to heal it. A system that revealed holiness, but could not produce it. And this is the part many modern believers do not grasp. The law was a mirror, not a cure, a spotlight, not a surgeon, and it did exactly what it was meant to do by exposing just how torn the human garment truly was. Yet over time, people began treating that mirror as if it were medicine, and those rituals as if they were transformation, until the diagnosis became an identity, and the people forgot that the law was pointing forward to someone greater, someone who would not patch their sin, but replace their nature, someone whose presence would make the entire system obsolete. And when Jesus arrived, the shock was not that he brought something new. The shock was that the new was so powerful, it made the old collapse. And this collapse was not accidental. It was intentional. Because grace cannot exist inside a framework built on earning. And the old covenant had exhausted itself by proving again and again that no one could be righteous by trying harder, that no one could repair their own garment no matter how many sacrifices they offered, that no amount of rule keeping could create the heart God designed his people to have. And so Jesus came with a new cloth that was not another version of the law, but the fulfillment of it, something the law had been whispering since the beginning. And when he unveiled it, the world shifted beneath the feet of everyone listening, because the entire spiritual architecture they trusted was not being remodeled, it was being replaced. And this terrified the leaders who depended on that system for their identity, their authority, and their pride. But Jesus was not speaking to their comfort, he was speaking to the truth. And the truth was simple. The law was perfect in purpose but insufficient in power. It could reveal sin but not remove it. It could restrain the flesh but not transform it. It could create rituals but not rebirth. And when the perfect sacrifice arrived, the shadows had to fade. Because grace does not patch the old heart. Grace creates a new one. And if you feel resistance rising in you right now, it is because part of you still believes that your effort should count for something, that your discipline, your devotion, your good intention should earn at least a partial patch. But God is not dealing in partials. He is dealing in resurrection. And resurrection has no use for old fabric. It does not repair the corpse. It replaces it with life. And this is where you must face the uncomfortable truth about yourself. The old system inside you, the one built on striving, survival, and self-improvement, has already done all it can do. It showed you your limits, but it cannot lift you beyond them. It exposed your weakness, but it cannot strengthen you. It revealed your guilt, but it cannot wash it away. And every time you try to achieve your way into spiritual wholeness, you are repeating the same cycle. Israel lived for centuries, patching a garment that was never meant to survive the weight of glory. And maybe the reason you feel exhausted is because you are trying to carry what Christ already fulfilled. Maybe the reason you feel constantly unworthy is because you are measuring yourself by a covenant that was never meant to give you worth. Maybe the reason you feel torn inside is because you are mixing the language of grace with the pressure of law. And the two will never blend, because grace does not reward effort. Grace resurrects the dead. Grace does not congratulate you for managing your sin. Grace destroys the chains from the inside out. Grace does not give you a slightly better version of who you were. Grace gives you a new identity that does not fit inside any system you built before. And at some point you must decide whether you truly want that freedom, or whether you still prefer the familiar rules that once made you feel in control. Because the law gives structure, while grace gives surrender. The law gives definition, while grace gives transformation. The law gives distance, while grace pulls you into the presence of God. And when Jesus stood among people who had memorized every command, he was not asking them to try harder. He was asking them to let go, to release the garment they had spent their whole lives perfecting, because it could never hold the weight of the kingdom that had now arrived. And today he is asking you the same. Stop trying to impress God with a garment he already declared insufficient. Stop trying to sew a new life onto an identity built from fear. Stop trying to earn what can only be received, and let grace do what the law never could. Remake you from the inside out. Because the moment you stop patching is the moment the new creation begins. There is a reason Jesus warned that the tear becomes worse. A reason that goes far deeper than the surface level meaning of fabric pulling apart. Because he was describing a spiritual reality that almost no one wants to admit. The reality that the most painful damage does not come from ignorance but from resistance. From knowing the truth yet refusing to surrender to it. From hearing the call of God and still clinging to the old ways with trembling hands, hoping you can force the new to fit the old, even as it rips you open from the inside. And this is the tragedy so many believers live in without realizing it, the place where they have seen enough of Jesus to be convicted, but not enough to be transformed, where they have tasted just enough of the kingdom to feel the pull, but not enough to break free from the grip of their old identity. And the tension between what God is trying to bring and what you refuse to release becomes a tearing that feels like emotional collapse, spiritual confusion, and inner panic, because the new cloth does not sit politely in the background waiting for you to make space. It begins to pull the moment it touches your life, pulling at your pride, pulling at your habits, pulling at your secret sins, pulling at the wounds you have hidden for years, pulling until the old structure can no longer hold itself together. And if you do not surrender fully, the tearing becomes violent, not because God is punishing you, but because he refuses to let you live divided. And this is why some people fall harder after meeting Jesus than they did before they ever knew him. They feel the weight of conviction but refuse repentance. They feel the call to change but stay loyal to their old patterns. They feel the presence of God but keep feeding the appetites that destroy them. They feel drawn to holiness but cling to comfort, and the inner conflict becomes unbearable. A tug of war between heaven and self, between freedom and fear, between surrender and control. And that battle tears the soul apart more aggressively than any external failure ever could. Because before you met Christ, your brokenness felt normal. It was all you had ever known. The garment was old but familiar, but once you encounter the new, the old can never feel comfortable again. It can only feel cramped, suffocating and unstable, and yet many still try to force it, hoping they can return to old habits without consequences, hoping they can mix purity with poison, hoping they can maintain an image of faith while feeding the very things that war against it. And Jesus says the tear becomes worse, because trying to keep both worlds always leads to collapse. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly and quietly, like a seam growing weaker each day, like a life losing integrity, one compromise at a time, until finally the pressure reveals what you refuse to face, and that is when many believers panic, asking, why does this hurt so much? Why is God letting me fall apart? Why does surrender feel like breaking? And the answer is both simple and terrifying, because you are being pulled apart from the inside by two identities that cannot coexist. The identity God is trying to give you and the identity you refuse to bury. And until you choose which one you will live in, the tearing will not stop. And you may think this is cruel, but it is actually mercy, because a divided heart is the most miserable place a human can live, constantly battling itself, constantly second-guessing, constantly wearing a mask that feels tighter every day, constantly trying to preserve the old life while longing for the freedom of the new. And Jesus will not let you remain in that misery forever. He will push the tension until you either surrender or break. And breaking, though painful, is often the doorway to breakthrough. Because sometimes the garment must tear completely before a person finally admits they cannot fix themselves. They cannot heal their trauma alone. They cannot discipline their way out of sin. They cannot control their way into peace. They cannot negotiate with idols and expect anything but chaos. And when the tearing becomes unbearable, that is when surrender becomes possible. But if you do not surrender, the tear becomes worse. Not only because of the pressure of the new, but also because of the stubbornness of the old. Your pride refuses to give up. Your fear refuses to trust. Your wounds refuse to be exposed. Your habits refuse to die. And the garment becomes stretched thin between the person you once were and the person God is calling you to become. And nothing is more painful than living between two selves, between two worlds, between two destinies. And this is exactly what Jesus was warning. Not about cloth, but about souls. The souls torn by half obedience, half devotion, half repentance, half transformation. People who tasted the new but clung to the old and found themselves unraveling. And maybe, without realizing it, you have felt this tearing too. The exhaustion that comes from pretending, the anxiety that comes from divided priorities, the guilt that comes from half surrender, the emptiness that comes from trying to live a spiritual life without spiritual death. And if so, Jesus is not condemning you. He is calling you to stop patching and start surrendering before the tear widens further. Because the new was never meant to blend with the old. It was meant to replace it entirely. And until you let the old die, the new will always feel like a threat instead of a gift. There comes a moment in every believer's life when pretending stops working, when the mask you built to look righteous starts cracking under the weight of reality, when the polished version of yourself that you present to the world no longer matches the turmoil happening beneath your skin. And this is the moment Jesus was speaking into when he warned that you cannot sew the new onto the old. Because the most dangerous form of patching is not patching habits or routines, but patching identity, hiding behind a religious exterior while carrying an untransformed heart, acting like everything is fine, while the inside of your soul strains to hold itself together, and pretending may feel spiritual for a while. It may even earn you approval from people who are fooled by outward appearances. But God is not impressed by patches of performance, and he is not moved by carefully staged devotion. And the longer you pretend, the more the tear grows inside you, because the truth is you cannot fake surrender, you cannot fake repentance, you cannot fake transformation. And no matter how convincing your spiritual mask appears, there will come a point where the pressure of reality pushes through the threads and exposes everything you tried to hide. Not because God delights in exposing you, but because he refuses to let you suffocate beneath the weight of your own illusion. And this is what so many modern believers misunderstand. They think pretending will keep them safe, when in fact it is the very thing tearing them apart, because a divided soul cannot breathe and a double life cannot stand. And the more you try to sew Jesus onto the surface while resisting him in secret, the more violent the inner tearing becomes. A tearing between who you pretend to be and who you actually are, between the truth God speaks and the lies you still choose, between the calling that pulls you forward and the shame that pulls you back. And living in that in-between space is unbearable. It robs you of peace. It robs you of joy. It robs you of identity. It robs you of intimacy with God. And worst of all, it convinces you that you are unworthy of the very transformation God is trying to bring. Because the mask becomes a prison, convincing you that if people knew the real you, they would walk away. Convincing you that if God saw the real you, he would reject you. But here is the truth. Jesus came to expose. God sees the real you already. He sees the fear beneath your confidence, the insecurity beneath your pride, the wounds beneath your strength, the sin beneath your smile, and he still calls you, still reaches for you, still refuses to let you drown in your own disguise. And this is the mercy hidden inside the tearing, that God will pull apart the mask before the mask destroys you. And maybe you have felt that recently. Moments where the gap between your public faith and private reality became too wide to hold together. Moments when a familiar habit began to disgust you instead of comfort you. Moments when the version of yourself you tried to maintain felt heavy and false. Moments when you sensed God pulling at the threads of your identity and you panicked because you knew the mask was slipping, and you scrambled to reinforce it, to tighten the stitches, to hide the weakness. But the harder you worked, the more the tension grew, because pretending is exhausting, and Jesus will not let you build a life on a lie, and sooner or later the mask must tear. And when it does, the shock is not that others see you differently, but that you finally see yourself clearly. Stripped of excuses, stripped of self-deception, stripped of the performance that kept you spiritually numb. And in that raw honesty, God does his deepest work, because he cannot heal what you hide, and he cannot transform what you defend. And this is why Jesus confronted the Pharisees so intensely, not because they were worse sinners than others, but because they hid their brokenness behind rituals and rules. They were experts at wearing the garment of righteousness while refusing the heart of righteousness. And Jesus ripped through their illusion with compassion, disguised as confrontation, because exposing the lie was the only path to freedom. And the same remains true for you today. The mask will not save you. The performance will not hold you. The pretending will not transform you. And if you continue to patch your identity with spiritual language while avoiding true surrender, the tearing will only become more severe, not to destroy you, but to free you, because God would rather break your illusion now than watch it break your soul later. And this is the moment you must decide whether you will keep pretending or finally step into truth, whether you will keep patching or finally surrender the whole garment. And the question becomes painfully simple. Who are you when no one is watching? And are you willing to let God into that place? Because that is where the real transformation begins. And that is where the tearing finally stops. Not when you become perfect, but when you become honest, when the mask falls and the new garment can finally be placed on your shoulders. There is a moment in every spiritual journey when the rituals that once felt comforting suddenly feel empty, when the prayers you memorized lose their warmth, when the songs you sang no longer stir your spirit, when the practices that once made you feel close to God now feel like standing outside a locked door. And this moment is not a sign that you have failed, but a sign that God is pulling you out of ritual and into relationship. And this shift is far more violent than people expect, because rituals are predictable, they give structure, they give familiarity, they give the illusion of closeness without requiring vulnerability. But relationship demands your heart, your truth, your honesty, your surrender. And the old garment fears that level of exposure. So it tightens around you like armor, trying to protect you from the very intimacy God is calling you into. And this is the tension Jesus confronted when he spoke the parable, because the people around him knew how to perform devotion, but they did not know how to receive love. They knew how to follow rules, but they did not know how to follow God. They knew how to look holy, but they did not know how to be whole. And Jesus tore through that illusion by showing them that adding him to their rituals would never give them relationship, that a patched faith would never lead to a transformed life. And the modern world is no different, because millions today know how to attend church without knowing God, how to quote scripture without living truth, how to confess with their mouth while resisting with their heart, how to maintain spiritual habits that keep them busy but not surrendered. And this is why Jesus is still pulling people out of ritual. Not because rituals are wrong, but because rituals cannot hold the weight of intimacy. And when God begins drawing you closer, you will feel the tearing in places you once felt secure, the tearing of routines that no longer satisfy, the tearing of beliefs that no longer fit your growth, the tearing of spiritual habits that once soothed you but now feel hollow, the tearing of a faith built on knowledge instead of encounter. And many panic at this stage, believing something is wrong with them, believing they have grown cold, believing God has grown distant. But the truth is the opposite. This is the moment when God is closer than ever, pulling you away from the outer courts of ritual into the inner courts of relationship, calling you to know him not through tradition but through presence, not through repetition but through communion, not through performance but through intimacy. And intimacy terrifies the old garment, because intimacy means being seen, being known, being undone, and being rebuilt. So the old identity fights back, trying to preserve the comfort of familiar patterns, even when those patterns keep you spiritually numb. And perhaps you have felt this too. The moment when your faith felt too small for the hunger inside you, when the God you heard about no longer satisfied you because you needed the God you could encounter, when the version of Christianity you lived could not carry the weight of your questions anymore, when the routine no longer matched the depth of the longing in your chest, and you wondered what was wrong with you, why the old rhythms were breaking, why the old confidence was fading, why the old way of relating to God no longer felt real, and you blamed yourself without realizing that this tearing was an invitation, not a punishment. Because God will break the ritual if it keeps you from the relationship. He will strip away the habit if it keeps you from the heart. He will tear the garment if it keeps you from intimacy. And this is where you must confront the deepest truth of this parable. Jesus did not come to help you perform faith. He came to help you live it, walk it, breathe it, embody it. He came to tear down every barrier that keeps you from experiencing God, not as an idea, but as a presence, not as a doctrine, but as a father, not as a tradition, but as a friend. And when you resist this closeness, the tear grows worse, because the tension between ritual and relationship is unsustainable. One will eventually overpower the other. And if you cling to ritual, the relationship withers. But if you surrender to relationship, the ritual transforms into something alive, no longer a performance but an overflow, no longer an obligation but a response, no longer a patch but a reflection of what God is doing inside you. And this is what Jesus was offering all along. A life where God is not a distant authority but a near companion, a guide, a voice, a refuge, a father who walks with you through every quiet moment and every storm, a presence woven into your ordinary life. And the question standing before you now is the same question faced by those listening to Jesus 2,000 years ago. Are you willing to let God pull you out of ritual so he can bring you into relationship? Are you willing to let the familiar tear so something real can take its place? Because the God calling you now is not asking for performance. He is asking for you. There comes a point in the journey where hearing the truth is no longer enough, where being inspired is no longer enough, where understanding the parable is no longer enough. Because the new covenant Jesus brings does not ask for admiration. It demands allegiance. It demands that you not only look at the garment he offers, but actually put it on. And this is where people hesitate the most, not because they do not believe in Jesus, but because they fear what his new life will cost them. They fear what they will have to release. They fear the death of the identity they have spent years building. And yet this fear is precisely why the old garment has to go, because the old identity cannot carry the weight of glory. It cannot hold the presence of God. It cannot survive the intensity of transformation. And the moment Jesus offers you his new garment, he is also asking you to choose, to decide which version of yourself you are willing to live as. And this choice is terrifying, Because the new covenant is not an accessory you add to your life. It is the end of the old life entirely. And many people want Jesus to guide them without letting him rule them. They want him to comfort them without letting him correct them. They want him to bless them without letting him break them. But the new covenant has no room for partial obedience. It has no space for selective surrender. It has no patience for half commitment, because the kingdom of God cannot rest on a divided foundation. And the moment you try to plant one foot in grace and one foot in self-preservation, the ground beneath you begins to crack. Not because God is punishing you, but because two kingdoms cannot occupy the same heart. And this is where so many modern believers silently struggle. They want transformation, but on their terms. They want freedom, but without exposure. They want divine purpose, but without sacrificing personal comfort. And their faith becomes a tightrope between desire and fear, between calling and control, between who they know they could become and who they are terrified to stop being. And living in that tension becomes unbearable. So Jesus speaks through the tearing, reminding you that the garment of your old self was never meant to withstand what he is trying to give you, because the new covenant does not negotiate. It recreates. It does not decorate the old life. It replaces it with something that carries the weight of eternity, something unbreakable, something unearned, something costly beyond measure. And the cost is not money or effort or moral behavior. The cost is you, your ego, your pride, your stubbornness, your wounds, your idols, your self-made identity. And this is where the war happens, not between you and God, but within you, between the version of yourself you created and the version God formed in the secret depths of his design. And if you listen closely, you can feel that war even now. The old self pulling you back into patterns that feel familiar but hollow. The new self pulling you forward into a life that feels terrifying but true. And the longer you resist, the stronger the tearing becomes, because the new covenant cannot fit into the spaces your fear has fenced off. And this is the moment Jesus is trying to bring you to, the moment of decision, the moment where you can no longer pretend, no longer negotiate, no longer blend old and new, the moment where you finally see that the old garment is not just insufficient but incompatible. And once you see this clearly, every excuse collapses, because you realize you were not being asked to lose yourself, but to finally find yourself. Not the self shaped by wounds or applause or expectations, but the self shaped by God. And when this truth sinks in, the fear begins to loosen, because you understand that surrender is not destruction but resurrection. It is not abandonment but adoption. It is not losing identity but receiving a truer one. And yet, even with this revelation, many still hesitate, wondering what will happen if they truly let go, wondering who they will become if they stop patching and finally surrender. And the answer is the same one Jesus offered 2,000 years ago. You will become new, entirely, irrevocably, beautifully new. And the chains that felt embedded into your soul will fall away. The guilt that clung to your conscience will burn off like fog under sunlight. The identity that felt heavy and constricting will dissolve, replaced by a garment woven from grace. And this is what Jesus wanted from the beginning. Not patched religion, not halfway devotion, not spiritual compromise, but transformation so complete that your life becomes a living testimony of the new covenant, a story only God could write. And the question standing in front of you now is not complicated, though it carries eternal weight. Will you keep trying to stitch Jesus into the remains of who you used to be? Or will you let the old garment fall and step into the life he died to give you? Because the tearing only stops when surrender begins. There is a moment, a breaking point, a quiet but thunderous collapse inside the human soul, when you finally realize that holding on to the old garment is no longer courage, but bondage. When every stitch you try to reinforce can no longer hide the truth that who you used to be cannot carry the weight of who God is calling you to become. And in that moment, something shifts, not softly but decisively, like the final thread snapping in a fabric that was never meant to survive. And you stand there, exposed, vulnerable, stripped of every layer you once hid behind. But for the first time in your life, you are not afraid, because you finally understand that the tearing was not the end, but the invitation to a beginning you never believed you could have. A beginning Jesus has been offering since the first moment you felt the pull of his voice cutting through your defenses. And now the truth rises within you with unmistakable clarity. The old garment is not your prison because you sinned. The old garment is your prison because you outgrew it. You were not made to spend the rest of your life stitching yourself back together. You were made to be clothed in something unbreakable, something eternal, something crafted not by your effort but by the hands of the one who formed you before you ever took your first breath. And this is where the power of the parable becomes undeniable, because Jesus never asked you to perfect the old life. He asked you to release it, to let it fall, to let it die, so that he could cover you with something that does not tear under pressure or shrink when washed or fade with time. And the moment you allow the old garment to slip out of your hands, something miraculous happens, something the religious leaders of his day could not tolerate, and something many believers today still resist. You discover that surrender is not falling. Surrender is being caught. Surrender is realizing that every patch you clung to was keeping you from the life you were created to live. Surrender is letting the God who sees every hidden scar clothe you in a righteousness that does not depend on your strength. And once you taste this, once you feel the weight of shame lifted and the chains of performance snap and the heavy identity you once carried dissolve like dust in sunlight, you finally understand why Jesus refused to be sewn in. He refused because anything less than full surrender would leave you still trapped, still exhausted, still torn. And he wanted more for you than survival. He wanted transformation. He wanted resurrection. He wanted a new creation that bears no resemblance to the fragments you once tried to hold together. And as this truth floods your spirit, you begin to see something you never noticed before. The new garment is not just a covering, but a calling. It does not only protect you, it redefines you. It speaks a new identity over you. One that is not shaped by failure, not shaped by fear, not shaped by wounds, not shaped by human approval, but shaped by the God who gave everything to make you his. And as you stand in that revelation, the world you once clung to begins to lose its pull. The old priorities lose their urgency, the old temptations lose their attraction, and even the old fears that used to control you begin to evaporate because you are no longer wearing the identity they once attached themselves to. And this is the secret the parable was always pointing toward. The moment you put on Christ, truly put him on, not as a patch, but as your entire identity. The tearing stops, the striving ends, the confusion clears, and you finally walk in a confidence that does not come from ego, but from belonging, not from performance, but from grace, not from your past, but from his promise. And this is the moment everything changes, because you finally realize that the garment Jesus offers is not fragile, it is fearless. It is woven from mercy and authority and truth and power, dyed in the sacrifice of the Lamb, stitched together by the Spirit, and sealed by a covenant that cannot break. And when you wear this garment, the world cannot label you, your sin cannot define you, your failures cannot stain you, and your past cannot claim you. And now the question rises, heavy and holy. What will you do with this new garment? Will you wear it only when life feels hard, or will you choose to live in it every moment of every day? Will you hide it when others disapprove, or will you walk boldly knowing that heaven clothes you? Will you treat it as decoration, or will you let it become your identity? Because the moment you say yes to this calling, your life becomes a testimony, a living reminder that the new covenant does not patch the broken, it resurrects them. And this is where the story ends, but your story begins. In the place where the old garment falls and the new one settles across your shoulders, heavy with glory, light with grace, and unshakable in its promise that you are his, fully, eternally, completely his. And now with the last thread of your old life finally released, the invitation stands before you with astounding simplicity. Will you wear the new garment, or will you return to the one that kept you torn for so long?